The occult is founded on the presumption of hidden knowledge, which includes the function of secret government operations, which is commonly referred to as wizardry or sorcery inside the Bible. At which point, the assumption of everyone who supports the Bible would reaffirm its position on sorcery, which is it is to be condemned as its base purpose is defrauding the government, which generates the position of a self-deceit, which generates the exponential compounding nature of corruption, which catastrophically destroys the general public stability, as its system is an agreed suicide pact, at which point the function is the eventuality of the extortions of essential aspects of the ecosystem, stabilizing it until it creates something similar to the Final Fantasy XVI's Blight, which is the function of extorting nature, which is giving the nutrients, which is producing the magic in question, which facilitates your overuse, which facilitates your overextortions, which facilitates the death of the thing because it isn't able to stabilize the inferior quantity of nutrients, which generates its death, which is the referred to blight, which is nothing more than the extortion itself, which is the existence of the sorcery, at which point the defrauding of the government by the sorcery, by the criminalizing of evidence, by the creation of false secrets for the express purpose of maintaining this position is the guaranteed suicide pact of the collapse of that system according to the arrangement. They are an enemy of war to the system itself, at which point the act of treason means they are not acting in their office, and the act of not acting in their office means they're an individual without a legal government, independent of any legal authority, and certainly not sovereign, and thus they cannot claim sovereign immunity to destroy or murder the sovereign, which they are doing in practice. These criminal simulations create the position for their extortions, such as the position of the definition of rape, which is the coerced sex. Now, the simulation for the coerced sex is that it wasn't coerced, is that the rapists themselves are fulfilling the fantasy that this is something that they're owed and deserve and is legitimate and orderly, and that there is no offense, that they in fact deserve it or they are capable of taking it and thus they deserve it because of their ability to extort it. It's rightfully their position, is the delusion systematically generated for those arrangements. But the in practice legal answer is that the extortion is a criminal felony and that there are various violations of those agreements, such as the coercion over other people's bodies, such as the coercion over other people's papers or effects, over their existence and human decency, over their liberty of self-determination to not be restrained, coerced, or manipulated into the particular interest of the coercer for the secret simulation, or the position of the pursuit of their own happiness, which, not being restrained, facilitates their own arbitrary engagement into the market, facilitating the manufacture of the pretext of capitalism, which is owed by law in the United States, at which point the position of the wizard communists are just white nationalist communists who want to reassert the glory of Confederacy, bringing back the plantations where they can arbitrarily hold slaves to extort infinitum, at which point it doesn't matter if the blight takes the nigger because they're trash and don't really mean anything, and thus you can whip them, and thus you could beat them, and thus you could extort them, and then they can die off, and then they can be replaced, and it doesn't really matter to them because they aren't worth anything to the extorter, which is in practice what they're doing in the United States, because the purpose is to collapse the system of the United States, as the United States is trash to them because it is the thing in their way to their arbitrary wants according to the corruption, which facilitates their means of permanently automating the function of their extortionary abusive nature as psychopath insurrection. At which point the objective is to find fraudulent arguments in order to endorse the breeding of psychopathy, at which point such false arguments, such as it's better to send a psychopath off to war because they'll come back unharmed, psychologically, as opposed to a non-psychopath who will come back mentally traumatized. The argument is fundamentally flawed, as the position is the stability of the system, and thus the breeding and empowering of psychopaths is giving the exponential quantity of the population who are going to be controlling the most essential pieces of the equipment, who do not have loyalty to the function of the pretext of the equipment. The non-psychopaths will keep the agreement, and the psychopaths will not keep the agreement. And the psychopaths who aren't affected by war don't have a problem with violating the rules in being a felon, in being a rapist, in being a creepy weirdo using unitary executive theory in order to rape children and stalk them in the mall. That's not really something that really affects them psychologically or emotionally or in any particular specific interesting way to them specifically, as they are status creeps who by definition do not believe that there is a rule of law, and thus there is no way for the law to enforce itself. And because the Constitution doesn't have anyone to enforce it, it's fully vulnerable and can be ignored in favor of the psychopathy, which is overthrown the system, at which point there is no law enforcement, at which point there are no agents of the government of the United States Constitutional Republic, which is their enemy of war to death for the creation and permanent standardization of the simulation of their right to their abuses, which generates the system of the extortions against the general public, exponentially compounding the misery of the general public who do not have the stability owed to them, and thus are their life is sucked out of them like a vampire, because the blight, having been affected to them specifically, is sucking out their entire life from the extortions, stealing the properties owed to them in favor of the arbitrary nonsense, which is temporary at best, as a benefit to the ones who are extorting them, who don't really think it's that interesting. They can buy a car and they can get in a wreck, and it doesn't matter because there's always more cars, because they don't have to be the one to pay for it. It doesn't mean anything to them. So those who are going to be doing it under the system that they've bred are specifically the exact kind who no one would want to be able to have access to. The common tactic of the psychopath is to engage in the victim blaming, as the victim not giving them is something is the only one violating the terms in their mind, which manifests the position of their additional abuses beyond their pure lust. So take for instance, you have two people in a contest. Player one is normally going to be graded as the winner. So player two forfeits in order to get a fake victory psychologically that does not transfer to the legal victory, at which point they're there to show up for a participation award. And the irony is the exact person who would commit the forfeit would be the exact person who would make fun of people who take the participation awards, at which point their entire life is an irony of making fun of themselves, as they are the butt of their own jokes. But they're too stupid in order to understand that they are, in fact, the inferior twat who doesn't deserve the things. At which point, the subject isn't that they are against participation awards, it's that they are against demeaning the effect of the awards of what they delusionally believe they have rightfully stolen by their forfeit, which facilitates the mechanism that they want to be able to just steal it because they can. And the act of being able to is the only justification the psychopaths have to earn the thing. At which point, the actual winner, having been the victim of the cheating, is then exponentially condemned and attempted to be insulted and humiliated by the ones who are engaged in the forfeiture, and they collecting their friends around, taking the returns of the stolen resources derived by their forfeiture, actively use as a mechanism in order to get retaliation against the lawful winner, who, in that act of being the free market success, is the highest level enemy to them because it is the biggest threat to the existence of their fraudulent games, which they would have to forfeit if the acknowledged rule of law took over, certifying that the forfeit was a forfeit, and thus they didn't win, and thus their earnings from that and the compounding interest of those earnings as a loan would have to be returned in its proper order, and thus the winner, having provided it to them on loan, needs to be compensated according to the normal policies and rules of a loan, which generates the mechanism of the restoration of the balanced order, which normalizes the arrangement, such as, but is not limited to, voter fraud, which engages in the sabotage. So, take the WaronDavid, for instance. The Confederates who have infiltrated the government have sought the militant overthrow of the constitutional republic for those purposes, and viewing David as the aristocracy, have arrested him as the patriarchy and actively radicalized the female Gnosticis to chant death to the patriarchy, turning the general public against those who were protecting them from the rape culture simulations, which they have consistently been complaining about, at which point they are responsible for their own captivity into the subject, which would be retaliated against if they did not by the rapists, but then they're just creepy psychopaths. And there was no version that you are going to be safe with them because their inherent nature. And if you allow them to do whatever they're going to do, then they're going to exploit you, turning you into the blight, which is the vampiric sucking of your blood or the taking of your life willingly, such as, but it's not limited to, the functions of the Holocaust, with the mass killing and genocide, which is inherently natural to exactly their type. So, understanding the psychopath's position, they would have to retaliate against the rightful winners, and thus those who are good have to be looked at as though they were bad, and thus you have the inversion or the changing by the occult practice. At which point, the function of the Luciferian wizards or the satanic cultists who want to use government for secrets to protect their crimes, such as blocking the Jeffrey Epstein's client list of the mechanism of his criminal felonies and their compounding interests, would facilitate the acknowledgement of their core definition, at which point the act of supporting them in these pretexts or baseline policies or strategies is aiding and abetting, is co-signing the offense, and thus if you are a 1776 type person and you're a victim of a crime, then by definition uh, you aren't in 2012. And the person who's in 2012 says to themselves, I'm pretty cool and normal and modern, and I'm the best thing in the entirety of history, but I'm going to go ahead and say there should not be a remedy to the 1776 guy, because the 1776 guy, if they aren't victimized, then the compounding interest of the crime doesn't get to me. So I need to protect the crime's value so it stays in those areas so that it doesn't switch back to the rightful people, is aiding and abetting after the fact. And by definition, that is criminal intent, otherwise known as guilt. The victims of those systems historically, such as the mechanism of the creation of the false experiments of the violation of the right to their body, in the protections of their persons, the papers of theirs, of their life, their liberty, and their human decency, their pursuit of their own happiness. The function of poisoning them in order to create a substantive difference is the mechanism to, for instance, remove their right of self-determination with the creation of homosexuality as an interest to them biologically by the use of poison, which removes their right to self-determination or the pursuit of their own happiness, which is manipulated by the poison. Thus, the violation of their body or their person is the violation of their pursuit of happiness, which is the acknowledgement that they are property and thus the violation of their right to liberty, and so on, which generates the exponential compounding position, which has to reaffirm the generic understood position that they were born that way. When they say, you can't be mad at me for this because I was born this way, just means that the wizard communists targeted them for the social engineering by tampering with their body, at which point their position of God is the cult god of the Luciferian wizards, known as the KKK, who have infected the government, at which point the mechanism of them doing so has created the baseline results, subsequently changing it from the legal answer, which is what they would have chosen had they not been manipulated, which requires them to have access to the information, such as discovery, which is blocked by secrecy by the illegal classification of the crime, which is not a function of the United States government, and thus cannot legally be protected by the United States government, as it is conducted by individuals without a legal government, and thus there are no rights to protect the offender.